The patrol lights hit the cracked concrete in quick, blue pulses that made the heat glitter. Brooklyn Lane stood with her palms flat on the cold metal pump, chest tight, the smell of gasoline and old coffee settling under the fluorescent canopy. Her breath came measured. Behind her, a voice clipped orders like a metronome. "Step away from the vehicle," Deputy Garza said. His hand rested near the holster the way a conductor keeps time with a baton. Brooklyn did what she'd been trained to do. She slowed the world to the smallest possible increments, counted the cadence of Garza's steps, felt a tiny microphone sewn into the strap of her undergarment press against her ribs with each inhale. The device was small, a sliver of plastic and wire, its serial tag a smear of ink she had hidden in a dead battery pocket. It was transmitting to an encrypted relay she'd tucked under the passenger seat 2 hours earlier, a little black box labeled TX704 in the field notes she'd logged at 12:47. In her mind, she kept the timestamp, 14:32, March 12. She would always keep the time. A cruiser rolled up slow, the sheriff's SUV, big, shiny, with a smile that fit on a campaign poster. Wade Brennan stepped out like a man walking into his living room, palms extended in that old-town charm, an aura of calm the way a boa constricts with a silk ribbon. "What brings you to town, ma'am?" he asked, and his voice said everything that none of his teeth did. He was the kind of man used to being given the benefit of every doubt. Brooklyn kept her face blank, let the heat on the back of her neck do what it would. The microphone did its small, steady work. A GPS beacon no larger than a wristwatch tucked beneath her sleeve pinged every minute to a server in Austin she couldn't see. In the pocket of her jacket, a spare backup transmitter waited. If they took the car, she would have a dead man switch to send the ledger and the ledger's photograph to the federal server. She'd rehearsed the failure modes until she could list them blind. Lost evidence, compromised witness, burned hard drive. Her training had taught her to assume the worst and prepare for it. A hand grabbed the back of her jacket. The scrape of fabric on her shoulder sounded louder than it should have. Garza's fingers were firm, not rough. "Name," he said. Brooklyn answered like a woman with nothing to hide, because, for the moment, she had chosen that story. Brooklyn Lane, passing through. The sheriff smiled at that. "You ever been through here before?" She told him she had, that she was visiting a cousin, that she sometimes passed through on runs to Odessa. Her voice was calm, worn smooth by practice. Underneath, the agent kept counting. The microphone's feed on the other end had a low hiss, static she'd trained to hear as if it were a second skin. She felt the slight vibration at her rib when the beacon sent its first ping, a neat clinical confirmation that somewhere a log had been written.
She had left a copy of that log with Marcus Cole at headquarters and with Priya Sharma, the journalist who had agreed to be their public amplifier. Priya's number was in her head like a prayer. "What's in the back?" Brennan asked after a long beat, eyes briefly flicking to the passenger window where a duffel lay, canvas dark with dust. It contained two things that made the sheriff's face harder: a ledger wrapped in plastic and an old phone encrypted with a password Brooklyn had memorized and never spoken aloud. "You can search," Brooklyn said. It was a decision she let the sheriff make. To resist would raise the stakes earlier than she wanted. "I have nothing to hide." 3 men moved with practiced choreography. Martinez produced a paper disclosure as if they were in a courtroom and read it aloud in a performative cadence. Brooklyn let them cuff her wrist for theater's sake while she did exactly what she had to do: keep the microphone direct to her chest, stay calm, let the sensor on her watch ping at 14:33. When they opened the duffel, the ledger, its cover, plastic fused and smudged in places, was visible. The sheriff's smile thinned. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded, and his hand closed on the ledger the way a spider closes on a fly. He flipped pages with a familiarity that suggested prior consultation. Deposits, names, coded entries, amounts that kept reappearing, references to collections and transport, a pattern that did not look to an outside eye like freelance labor payments. Brooklyn kept her face neutral as a photograph. Her brain logged names in the margins. The mayor's initials, the county account numbers, the routing code they'd seen on a scanned invoice last week. The microphone captured it all. Miles away, at a server farm behind locked doors, an analyst named Reyes watched the feed and typed a note. TX 704 live. Ledger visual confirmation. Sheriff possession. Timestamp 1435. Someone barked a laugh, the sound of too much confidence in a small town that had ruled itself for a long time. Brennan tucked the ledger under his arm, as if he were cradling a Bible. "We'll hold on to this," he said. "It looks like property taken." Brooklyn felt the burn of the fluorescent light on her skin, smelled the hot rubber of a burst tire down the block. She felt, very clearly, the narrowness of the opportunity. She met Brennan's eyes and, for the first time, let something other than a rehearsed lie slip. A small, unguarded flash of something like recognition. Not of him, no, of the thing she was trying to expose. He tilted his head as if to read that flash like a headline, and misread it. A voice in her ear, Marcus, low, clinical, said in her earpiece, "Hold. Not green yet. Photos to Priya go if extraction stack fails." It was the voice of someone who had been awake too many nights and still had cataloged all contingencies. She had obeyed that voice all through training. Now she had to obey it in flesh and consequence.
If you're watching from Del Rio or thousands of miles away, we've got a story that starts like this: small, contained, and explosive. If this clip hooked you, hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Stay with us through to the end. What follows is how patient evidence and a stubborn few forced an entire town to answer for itself. They took her to the station, the place that would later be called a bunker by those who wrote reports because it had the same closed, shadowed air. The intake room smelled of disinfectant and coffee gone stale. Fluorescent panels hummed. An officer took her statement like they took statements in a town that liked to record but distrusted those who would listen. Brooklyn answered in measured phrases, careful not to say anything that would prematurely alert the ledger's keepers. She watched the sheriff's office as she had watched a nest from the outside. All the habits, the way the deputy put his hands behind his head, the way the mayor's assistant left a message on the front desk, and the messages never touched paper again. The ledger went into evidence with a sticker that read EVD-17 and a chain of custody form that claimed the ledger had been logged by Sheriff Wade Brennan at 1443. The form itself would later become a hinge in the case. For now, it was a sheet of paper signed in the hand that jittered just enough to give an investigator like Brooklyn the chance to read in the tremor. Behind the glass, Brooklyn tried to be two things at once: the person the sheriff expected her to be, and the agent trying to keep every variable within the bubble she'd carved out. She let herself think, briefly, of Carlos Ruiz, the man who had handed the ledger to her a week earlier in a laundry room that smelled of bleach and sorrow. He had chosen to talk to her after they'd found his trailer burned, after a fire that had been clever about what it consumed and what it spared. He had looked at her like someone who had been given a baton and did not know how to run. Carlos's face was the face of compromise. He had been an ex-deputy who knew how to walk the thin line between county benefits and county ruin. He told Brooklyn one afternoon at the laundromat that the ledger was their map. "It's not about the money," he said then, folding his hands around his cup until the foam left a ring. "It's about who the town belongs to." Back in the intake room, a uniformed officer read Brooklyn her rights in a detached voice. "You understand that." The phrasing was routine, but the world curled around it. Brooklyn listened for the moment when the officer would say the word federal. It never came. Local custody implied local power. Local power implied risk. At headquarters, Marcus Cole watched the live feed, the feeds, the parallel lines of audio and video, the little rectangles of data. He noted the custody log and sent a terse message. "Do not relinquish. No local storage until verified. If ledger moved, override.
The message went through chain channels, through secure handles and briefed thumbs. For all their careful preparation, a leak could unspool everything. When the ledger left sheriff's custody, moved to a locked box under the watch of Deputy Martinez, Brooklyn felt the pinprick of panic. The micro-recorder hummed at her chest like a frightened insect. She closed her eyes and listened to the pattern of footsteps. She had planned for this possibility. Priya's camera phones with cloud backup had already captured images of the ledger pages at 11:02 that morning in a grocery parking lot. Priya had uploaded a low-res copy to an off-site server labeled PRY Arch 03 with a checksum and two-factor authentication. The plan had been to keep copies outside the sheriff's immediate control, to have public proof if the ledger ever vanished. But the ledger had not vanished. It had been co-opted, wrenched into the sheriff's ecosystem where forms were stamped and dust settled in the corners of long habits. Chasing it would mean proving not only that it existed, but that it linked to accounts, the cold arithmetic line items that pointed to money laundering, to transfer nodes in neighboring counties, to a string of accounts that reached a shell firm in a city 2 hours away. That was the work Brooklyn had been hired to do by a district court warrant. It was soft, relentless work that culminated in bank subpoenas and forensic accounting. As the hours passed, the town tightened. A symbol that had always signaled pride, a badge pinned at the chest, twisted into an emblem of unaccountable power. Mayoral letters circulated, cleverly worded, that praised the sheriff for maintaining order while quietly deflecting inquiries. A local radio show called in to the sheriff with softball questions that sounded rehearsed. The message rippled. The town could be policed from within. Outsiders had been taking notes. Brooklyn's phone, an innocuous burner with no identifying contacts, was put away in evidence, marked as item EVID 21. The microphone at her chest kept sending. The small black relay under the seat registered each packet and sent confirmations. PKT 001 success. PKT 003 success. Each packet contained a snippet of audio, a line of ledger text, a GPS trace. Each was a thread being woven into something larger. The next morning, an arson attempt set a trailer ablaze on the edge of town. It smoked like a wound opening. The fire ate at an old mattress and a stack of boxes. It had been clever, aimed at the storage units where Carlos had kept his things. No one was inside when the flames took hold. The sheriff's office called it suspicious. Carlos called it a message. Brooklyn stood at a distance and smelled the chemical tang of accelerant. She watched how the community reacted. Neighbors clustered on porches. The mayor's aide stood on a lawn with a telephone clapped against her ear, hands moving in small, worried gestures. The arson was not an accident. It was a signal. Someone was reminding people of the cost of bearing witness. The contact list in Brooklyn's head grew. Priya Sharma, whose thumbnail snaps could become proof. Marcus Cole, whose patience was threaded with consequences. A federal prosecutor in Austin who kept his face unreadable in a photograph. An honest county clerk in a nearby town who had once refused a bribe. They would be the scaffolding to lift the ledger's weight off the sheriff's desk and into court exhibits. But scaffolding required time. Time was shrinking. Priya called that evening at 19:08, her voice the rasp of someone who had been on too many press calls and knew the balance between caution and exposure. "They've got you on camera at the pump," she said. "They also have you on the intake footage. I'm seeing connections in the ledger to a courier company that cleared accounts to an offshore shell. I can push leaks, but if we push too soon, the ledger could disappear." Brooklyn answered, "Hold, we're working chain of custody. Marcus has dad requests in the pipeline." She said the acronym like a prayer. Disclosure and discovery, those documents that forced institutions to hand over records under court compulsion.
Marcus had filed a sealed warrant request at 2012 for immediate review. It would take time, but it would heft. In the meantime, the town tightened like a fist. For every small victory the team made, a photo uploaded, a bank routing number traced, there was a counterweight. Someone anonymous called Priya's editor and threatened a libel suit. Someone cut the power to the server rack at a county clerk's office for an hour and claimed an accident. Someone made a social media post that framed the ledger as a forgery, as if memos could be willed into truth by repetition. When a deputy named Garza stopped by Carlos's trailer and offered a kind of pity that felt like menace, Brooklyn felt the wall closing. She had to make a choice: keep fighting from the margins and risk losing her witness, her evidence, and perhaps the ledger itself, or escalate into a confrontation that would force federal hand. And with federal hand came a different danger. It would paint a target on her for anyone with a grudge. She chose the middle path she had always preferred: patience with an emergency plan. She slid a clean SD card into the little relay under the seat and set the backup transmitter to auto-burst at 2300, the hour she knew would be dark and quiet in most towns. She hid a snapshot of the ledger in a cloud that required biometric two-factor via Priya's secured account, and deposited a second encrypted copy with a trusted forensic archivist in Austin, a woman named Reyes who kept physical prints of everything, and who, Brooklyn had come to trust, would not be swayed by local politicking. But the town had its patterns, and people who profited from those patterns did not give up easily. 3 nights later, Brooklyn woke in a motel with the sound of something bumping the outer wall. 2, 3 dull thuds that could be coyotes or men on the move. She checked the watch under her sleeve. It registered motion and warmth, the kind of data the GPS beacon turned into a vector. It also showed a nearby ping. A vehicle had parked across the lot at 0210, engine idling, lights off. She could hear a distant radio chatter. She got dressed, quietly, and moved to her car. Priya's last message had been a single line: "They're watching." Brooklyn felt the air change with the weight of that sentence. She didn't run. She drove to a nondescript parking lot where an unmarked car waited. Agent Marcus Cole and 2 others, faces lit by a dashboard glow. They exchanged a look that needed no words and went in with a plan. But in a town where control was exercised through small cruelties, plans often collided with improvisation. Someone had decided to speed things up. A week after the intake room, after the arson, and after the power cut, an abduction changed the equation. Brooklyn was not alone in that night. She had watched with a hard calm as deputies had crossed boundaries, and once measured by the ledger's lines, someone decided to make her example. They took her outside the sheltered choreography of law and into a place that existed between custody and shadow. The grip on her arms was clinical, then rougher. A hood had been planned. A van idled as if on a grocery run. She felt the cloth being pulled down over her head, felt the sudden absence of light like a hand closing. Her breath felt too loud in the small dark. Her training said fight in the beginning. Create noise, create witnesses. Her training also said preserve the evidence. At the same moment, the beacon in her watch registered an unauthorized disconnection. The relay under the seat registered a forced silence, like a voice being cut. Protocols kicked in automatically. Dead man switch engaged. The backup transmitter launched packets to the Austin server. Its little bursts like flares cut through the dark. An encrypted ping labeled EMG Beacon 77 went out with the last coordinate: 31.3N minus 100.9W. An approximation, not perfect, but enough to narrow a search. Marcus was far enough away that he had to read the feed like a map. A sequence of pings, then silence, then silence. Then a jitter of movement. He called in the coordinates. Headquarters scrambled. Agents who had been sitting in quiet rooms at 0223 found their phones lighting up with a cascade of alerts. It took time, too much time, but federal procedure had force. A raid required orders, warrants, and coordination. They could not simply drive into a jurisdiction and violate the very process they were trying to protect. For all the cruelty of those who had captured Brooklyn, that adherence to legal form would be the engine that saved her. Inside the van, Brooklyn kept herself small. Her ears cataloged smell, old vinyl, sweat, cheap air freshener fighting with gasoline. She kept her head forward so the hood wouldn't choke her. She thought of the ledger in the sheriff's office, now likely in a safe somewhere behind steel plating. And she thought of Priya's low voice saying, "If they make you disappear, we leak everything." It was a promise, and also a threat, in the best way, that truth had options. At 0241, a nearby field recorder, worn, hand-mounted, belonging to a federal asset positioned like a sentinel under a willow tree, picked up muffled noise. The recording was low fidelity, just waves in the dark, but those waves contained a syllable that made Reyes, in the server room, sprint to open a sealed channel. "Audio verified," she typed into the sealed chat. Marcus, his jaw set, pulled a warrant through emergency channels and read it like a benediction at 0312. The raid that followed moved with strange judicial poetry. Agents crossed county lines with papers signed by a judge whose name had been faxed and then confirmed. The team's arrival in the early hours turned the town's artful confidence into startled movement. And when the door was breached, the sound was loud enough to split a knight's armor. A battering ram's cracked wood, a shout, the shuffle of a scuffle. Brooklyn remembers, later, the concrete chill of a floor against her cheek when the hood was ripped away. The first thing that reached her was light, too bright, clinical, like a surgeon's lamp. The second was a voice, gruff and close, saying, "Agent Lane?" She blinked, and the world reassembled itself into faces. Marcus, sweat on his collar. Priya with her camera phone held like an offering. A man in a suit who smelled of shoe polish and law. A deputy, hands raised, looked smaller than she'd ever known human hands could. In that moment, the ledger's ink had weight beyond paper. It had given them a map to claim back the town. The charges read out later reflected the architecture of the crimes: extortion, money laundering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, kidnapping of a federal officer. Each one a measured piece in a legal jigsaw. The sheriff's office called them serious allegations with a practiced eyebrow. The courthouse pressed its jaw into a statement about due process. At the press conference 2 days later, the room was packed with a community that had been watching itself crack. Priya stood near the front, camera in hand. Marcus stood with the district's federal prosecutor, watchful and precise. The ledger lay on a table covered with a navy cloth, opened to a page with an entry that matched a bank transfer they could trace to a shell corporation. An audio clip played through the room, muffled then clearer, of Brennan negotiating a collection at a motel, his voice measured, the money amounts precise. The transcript underneath held the line of truth: dates, times, transaction numbers, cross-references to account statements. They played the audio twice. The first time the room went quiet. The second time, half the faces in the room looked as if they'd been told a secret they already suspected. The evidence, the ledger, the audio, the bank records, functioned together like a grammar, each piece giving meaning to the rest. When the prosecutor announced arrests, Sheriff Wade Brennan, Deputy Martinez, a mayoral aide, there was a collective intake of breath. Arrests did not expunge the harm, but they reallocated the burden of proof. The prosecutor promised an investigation into the town's finances and the establishment of a victim compensation fund. They announced that the ledger and the audio had been preserved under chain of custody protocols, sealed evidence boxes, tamper-evident tape, digital hashes recorded and duplicated in 2 secure locations. The language was dull with legalism, but fierce in its consequence. Brooklyn watched from the edge of the crowd as people spoke in low groups, the tension easing into a cautious hope. Carlos Ruiz, who had been in the back, did not celebrate publicly. His shoulders still carried soot. He hugged Brooklyn with the sudden, awkward gratitude of someone who had been given back a sliver of life. Later, in private, he told her that the fire had been a warning, not an accident, a lesson to the weak. "You made it worse for them," he said, voice small. "You made it harder for them to pretend." She had made it worse, yes, but worse in a way that exposed corruption to the light. The symbol of the badge that had become an instrument of fear was now being handled by investigators in evidence bags. The ledger that had traveled into hands that would deny its existence had been photographed, hashed, and duplicated. The town, for a while, could not look away. There was, even so, a cost. Some deputies cooperated and were offered leniency. Others held fast to silence. The mayor issued a statement promising reforms and an independent audit, then spent long evenings in her office composing letters to the county. People who had been hurt, undocumented workers, families, were offered legal assistance, but many refused public testimony. Fear does not expire the moment an arrest is made. It lingers in the way neighbors look at one another at the mailbox. The arson had been a warning, and warnings become stories that persist. Brooklyn, exhausted, stayed in the background as hearings were scheduled and subpoenas served. She spoke in a closed courtroom with a prosecutor who cleared his throat and walked the ledger's numbers out like a map. On March 5, an entry of $8,500 is logged as transport fee. Each forensic accountant added texture to the pattern: transfers, shell accounts, a courier company that serviced certain routes. The legal filings were heavy with dates and routing numbers. They were the architecture of accountability. When asked, in the calm afterward, why she had told the sheriff to search her duffel at the gas station, Brooklyn said nothing dramatic, only what was true. "I needed to be in his custody so I could see where the ledger would be moved." It was a small gambit, a calculated risk. A week later, when a judge ordered that evidence be publicly filed, the ledger pages became exhibits with numbers in the margins that meant, in an oblique way, that paper could still indict power. In the quiet months that followed, a town that had once fit its civic life into smooth routines brewed uneasy change. An independent oversight committee was recommended. An audit began that traced irregular county deposits and procurement contracts back to a shell network. A compensation fund was established with an initial allocation that had been negotiated behind closed doors and announced in careful terms. No one pretended the fund would heal everything, but it was an admission that harm had been administered and that some currency must be returned. For Brooklyn, the aftermath was practical and lonely in equal measure. She was offered reassignment, a desk post that would keep her safer and further from the public eye. She chose, for now, to stay connected in quieter ways, sitting with those who had lost jobs, going to community meetings where she listened more than she spoke, letting Priya tell the public what had happened through tightly edited pieces that balanced anonymity and accountability. There were days she could still feel the hood around her head, the press of cloth, and the absence of light. Trauma was not theatrical. It was the way her body tensed at the smell of a particular cleaning fluid, the way she flinched when someone raised their voice for no reason. She saw a therapist who taught her to translate panic into data, a technique for an agent who had always made decisions with a ledger and a timestamp. The town, too, was different. Children were allowed back into playgrounds that had once felt watched. A mural went up near the courthouse, abstract, bright, a shield and a ledger folded into one another. And some people called it hopeful, while others called it an insult. The truth lives in strange middle grounds. At a small community hearing a year later, a woman named Marisol stood to speak. She had been an undocumented worker who had once been threatened into silence. She had been part of a group that received funds from the new compensation program. Her voice was steady. "We used to be afraid to go to the store," she said. "Now we go. We feel less like we are made of the wrong stuff." People clapped in a way that felt both relieved and wary. In the final legal filings, the court found enough to proceed to trial on charges of extortion and money laundering. Brennan and 2 others were indicted. The hearings were long and unglamorous, full of subpoenas, forensic spreadsheets, and witness calendars.
Justice, the court reminded everyone, was a process, not an event. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on several counts, some in the town felt vindicated. Others felt the verdict was only a beginning. Brooklyn watched the courtroom with a small, private satisfaction, the kind that comes after patient work, after waiting for paper to speak. She did not stand on podiums or give grand speeches. She did, however, walk into a community center down the block where survivors gathered, and she listened. There, someone pressed a paper cup of coffee into her hand and said nothing more than, "Thank you." On a quiet afternoon months later, Brooklyn sat on the back steps of the federal office, the sun lewd and generous. She took the GPS watch off, looked at its scarred bezel, and thought about the ledger's ink that had led them here. She had wanted to be invisible. She had instead become an instrument of visibility. It had cost them fear and offered them truth. She had learned, in the process, that accounts can be reconciled only by a long patience and a stubborn insistence that evidence survives the interference of power. Priya's final article in the series closed with a line, "Not every town will change, but some people will not stop." Brooklyn read it in print, the author byline small and steady. She thought of Marcus and Reyes and Carlos and the many who had risked small, steady things for larger justice. She thought of the gas station and the fluorescent light and the moment when a hood had been ripped away to reveal not only a person but the consequence of a choice. At the end of that day, she called Marcus and told him she was ready to take another case. He laughed softly, a sound like a belt eased after a long day, and said, "Take a week first. You earned it." She agreed, because even a patient person needs breath. The town settled into a quieter rhythm, not untouched but altered. The ledger remained in evidence, its pages scanned and stored in multiple secure backups, the hashes repeated like a prayer of verification. The badge that had once signaled fear was now, for some, a reminder. Authority must be watched. If this story moved you, if you believe in the hard work of accountability and the courage of those who keep lists and timestamps and microphones strapped close to their ribs, subscribe and share this with someone who thinks truth can wait. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. This matters. We follow up stories like these because small details, like a ping at 1432 or a ledger entry at 1102, can change a life. The heat that had once made the town shimmer now felt cooler, like a seam that had been unpicked and sewn again. Imperfect, but mended. Brooklyn walked into the evening with a badge of a different kind. Not an emblem pinned to a chest, but a ledger of minutes, a worn watch, friends who had not given up.
She had been confronted, like any black woman could be, in a country of power and assumption. She had also been more than that label, and the reveal of who she really was, an agent committed to procedure and patience, had been less a dramatic reveal than a testament to method. The town would remember the sound of the raid, the hush of the press conference, the slow work of auditors. They would also remember the ordinary things that changed. Children returning to playgrounds, a mural brightening a courthouse wall, people who once were silent finding their voices. A year on, Brooklyn found herself at a hearing where a judge spoke about the need to protect witnesses and to reinforce chain of custody protocols for small towns. She sat near Priya, who had a notebook and a kind of gentle fury in her eyes. Carlos had moved to another county and was starting work with a nonprofit that assisted laborers in dealing with county systems. Marcus had been promoted. Reyes continued to guard servers like a steward of small truths. There would be other towns, other ledgers, other nights and hooded threats. Brooklyn knew that. She also knew the ledger had been more than paper. It had been a mirror aimed at power. For a while, the mirror had shattered something that had once seemed indestructible in that town. The memory of Garza's hand on her shoulder, of the hood over her head, of the tiny mic snug against her ribs, these things lived inside her like small scars. They did not prevent her from living. They became markers she could map back to a time when evidence had been small and the stakes enormous. She kept the watch on her dresser as a quiet relic, a reminder that sometimes, to turn a town, you need a ledger, a camera, a patient team, and the conviction that truth matters. Months later, when the final audit made its way into public records and the compensation fund's first checks were issued, a local pastor called the process an answer to courage. Brooklyn did not call it anything so religious. She called it consequence. She called it work. She also, on a day when the sun was uncompromising and bright, stopped at the same gas station. The pump's concrete had a new patch over an old stain. The fluorescent light hummed that same indifferent hum. She filled the tank slowly, paid with a card that felt ordinary in her hand, and walked back to her car. For a moment, she allowed herself to look up at the clear sky and think how small victories pile up into something larger. Not perfect, not enough to erase what had happened, but enough to make a different path possible. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of servers and the ordered stacks of evidence boxes, the ledger rested like a ledger should, accounted for, visible, a record that changed a town by refusing to be hidden. The courthouse emptied in small, deliberate waves. People stepped out into the late light as if crossing from one weather into another. A discreet loosened tie here, a hand wiped at the eye there, a slow nod between strangers who had been part of the same uneasy thing. Brooklyn sat longer than most in the gallery, her palms flat against the wooden bench until the varnish warmed under her skin. Priya's pen had left a trail of ink along a margin. Carlos's jaw was set. Marcus, stoic as ever, kept his hands quietly clasped. Reyes walked the perimeter like a man who had learned to measure space in server racks and chain of custody forms. They had been a loose constellation during the months of work. Tonight they had become a small, visible cluster. When the clerk's voice came, lifeless and formal, announcing the plea agreement and the particulars of Garza's admission to misconduct and tampering with records, the words landed like stones in water, making circles, widening, then fading toward shore. Garza would face fines, a resignation from the department, oversight measures, and, crucially, an open path for the victim's claims. To some in the room, that meant justice. To others, it meant a ledger had won where words could not. Brooklyn felt both and neither. She thought of the hood and the mic and Garza's hand, small physical truths, and also of the ledger, which had become a public language capable of translating private harms into civic consequence. On the walk back to the car, a gust lifted a stack of papers from a vendor's cart. Brooklyn watched them settle across the sidewalk like white birds. A woman she had once helped, years before any of this had begun, called out her name and then stopped, surprised that she knew it. She mouthed a blessing, and Brooklyn returned it with a nod. There was a tremor in the town's daily life now, a new way that people recognized one another in public. It was not exactly trust, it was a cautious willingness to be seen. A month later, Brooklyn sat with a small group in the basement of the community center. The fluorescent bulbs hummed at the edges. Someone had brought coffee and left it to cool on a folding table. The group was an unlikely hand-picked assembly. A school teacher in from the north side, a young man who delivered for the bakery and wanted to learn how to protect his crew from the kind of paperwork erasure he'd seen, a woman who ran a night shelter and was looking for practical tools to keep lists safe.
Brooklyn liked practical things in the end: lists, timestamps, the horrid grammar of a properly completed chain of custody form. She set out a binder on the table, the cover marked with the organization's logo, and opened it to a page that began with "The Ledger, a Field Guide." She taught them the small things: how to photograph evidence with scale, how to mark the pages of a ledger with a unique stamp so entries could be verified, why a witness's signature mattered more than a whisper, how to insist on witnesses when an officer said no.
She explained, in patient sentences, why procedure could feel slow, but why slow often kept the most fragile things intact. At one point, a man in the back asked about fear, whether putting things down on paper could make someone a target. Brooklyn looked at him, understood the fear in the timbre of his voice, and told a story she had learned the hard way: that names, written wrong, could vanish; that timestamps, notated casually, could be dismissed; that courage had to be married to method. Outside, the town hummed with the small, ordinary noises of lives being rebuilt. The courthouse mural was nowhere near finished, but color had begun to bloom along the brick like new fruit. Children chased one another around a fountain that had been cleaned and repaired. The laughter made a curious, convincing argument for smallness and continuity. People were learning to return to places they had once avoided. It was not all recovery. There were nights when someone walked past Brooklyn's window and she felt the old knot in her throat. There were days she put the watch back on the dresser because its face seemed too heavy. Still, the ledger had taught her that memory could be held in a way that made the present answerable. Priya's piece ran in a Sunday feature, and then in another city paper, and then the piece was cited in a panel talking about police reform. She had a way with careful sentences that did not cheapen pain with rhetoric. In her article, she had written about the ordinary mechanisms that erode accountability: loose paper trails, overloaded clerks, the habit of accepting a story because it is easier, and people had noticed. A grant followed. Priya used it to fund a small fellowship to train community documenters in neighboring towns. Carlos's nonprofit found a partner to develop workshops for labor groups, and Marcus was asked to sit on a county board to advise on new guidelines. Reyes, asked to brief other departments, traveled with his thumb drive and an unshowy box labeled "Evidence, Chain of Custody." He took pride in boxing and labeling. It was a vocation he had not anticipated. People sent letters too. A woman named Elaine wrote a note about a receipt removed from a drawer after decades, a remnant tucked like a heart between old papers. She said that seeing those lines, dates, amounts, a name, felt like a resurrection. A teenager named Jordan scribbled that he wanted to learn how to make a ledger for the community center because stories get lost when phones die. These small messages accumulated like mortar, holding a fragile architecture together. There were also cracks. A late-night caller left a message on Brooklyn's office phone, someone with a number that masked its origin, threatening to set the ledger right. Brooklyn played the message once and then did not mention it aloud. Reyes, who had become unexpectedly tender about security, replaced locked cabinets and taught the staff to prefer face-to-face interactions for sensitive details. They installed a small, certified drop box for documents delivered after hours. Nothing dramatic, just more acts of care. Months after the plea, a public hearing convened to review policy changes. The room had been filled once by a glare of cameras. Now it was full of people with petitions folded in their hands. An alderman, reluctant at first, proposed a set of reforms that included mandatory logging of certain types of interactions, independent audits on use of force reports, and a new oversight committee with community representation. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed by enough to make a change. Brooklyn spoke at the hearing. She did not rehearse a speech. She told a simple set of facts about what she had seen and what the ledger had shown. "You cannot correct what you cannot count," she said, and then sat down. Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that had nothing theatrical in it.
At the nonprofit's opening workshop, Carlos stood by the doorway with a clipboard and his habitual half-laugh that tried to make hard topics feel less heavy. He had a knack for meeting workers where they were and then inviting them to consider procedures as a form of defense. When someone asked him if he was doing this because of what happened in town, he said, "I am doing it because I can't wait for someone else to learn the lesson we learned the hard way." He was optimistic in a practical register. The hardest moments for Brooklyn were private. She would wake in the dark, convinced she had missed a timestamp, convinced that some page had gone unnoted. In the kitchen she would stand with a mug and watch light through the blinds, and for a little while she might feel like the ledger itself, pages fluttering, at risk of being taken by the wind. It was in those hours that she relied, quietly and simply, on the habits that had kept her steady. Written lists, careful backups, a habit of checking and rechecking work. Method had become an affix for living. One afternoon, a woman from the shelter came with a child and sat down across from Brooklyn without fanfare. The child's hands were small and nimble. He had scraped his knee recently and now watched with wide attention as Brooklyn flipped through a small field notebook. "You helped my sister," the woman said. Her voice held a calm you could not teach. "We wanted to say thank you." She brought a thermos of soup and left it on the table as if it were nothing, and everything else, words, past violations, the ledger, was briefly irrelevant beneath the simplicity of human care. Brooklyn accepted the thermos and the thanks as if they were evidence of a kind that mattered just as much. There were moments of strange recognition. At a training session in another town, someone recognized the ledger system and reached across to compare notes. "We used a stamp like that in Riverdale," the stranger said. They traded not only tips, but a certain fatigue that came from long nights and longer paperwork. There was solidarity in the knowledge that systems, when learned and taught, could travel, could become contagious in the best sense. Not all contagion was positive. Headlines elsewhere announced scandals of a similar flavor, copies of old abuses playing out like dark rotations across a map. Those stories reminded Brooklyn that reforms required constant tending. It was easy to imagine complacency setting in, to think that a few policies could be the end of it. She refused to believe in endings. She believed in work. "The ledger is not the victory," she told a reporter once. "It is an invitation to keep working." Winter came slow, and with it a quieter steadiness. The playground's fountain froze edgewise, and the mural had a small section of a blue sky that matched the color of Brooklyn's old watch face. On a particular evening, Marcus took her aside. He carried a small envelope, heavy with the weight of civics and gratitude. The county board had appointed him to an oversight advisory role. He had recommended Brooklyn for a civilian committee. She hesitated. Her life, she felt, was made of cataloging risks and teaching others, not of committee schedules and public speaking. But she accepted. If the ledger had taught her one thing, it was that presence mattered where decisions were being made. Acceptance did not erase scars. There were days she declined invitations, nights she took the long way home, and one January morning she found herself standing at the gas station again, the same indifferent fluorescent light buzzing. The pump smelled faintly of cold asphalt. She filled the tank, paid with the same ordinary card, and stood for a second longer than she used to, looking up at the pale sky. Across the lot, a child dropped an ice cream cone, and everyone paused because it felt wrong for small things to break so easily. Brooklyn watched as a passerby bent to pick up the cone and bought another instead. These were gestures that did not fix everything, but they were the seams by which a town could be mended. A year and some months after the raid, there was a small plaque installed near the courthouse steps. It did not name a victory. It read instead as a prompt, for vigilance and for the patients who kept records. Someone from the community center suggested the wording. Priya helped edit it. On the morning the plaque was unveiled, there was a modest gathering. Children with paper flags crowded the front. An older man from the hardware store brought a folding chair and listened to the speeches like a man who knew the value of sitting quietly during important things.
Brooklyn, steadier than the first months, but still with a watch in her drawer that made her think of the weight of minutes, stood with her friends and listened. At the end of the ceremony, a young woman, no more than 20, came forward with tears and a trembling hand.
She had been a witness in early depositions too, frightened to speak at first, but later aided by the community's process and the ledger's clarity. She held out an envelope and said simply, "They told me to keep quiet. Someone showed me how to count instead." Inside the envelope was a handwritten ledger page, neatly dated, signed, its ink dry and stubborn. Brooklyn took it and folded it into her pocket as if it were a personal talisman. The ledger's pages, stored now in an archive that smelled faintly of paper and a cleansing oil the county had purchased, sat behind numbered glass. People came to see them as if to touch the past and carry its lessons outward. Not everything in the archive was dramatic. Alongside the pages were grocery receipts, a bus ticket, a child's drawing pressed now into the corner of an evidence folder. Those mundane things were not incidental. They were the weights that showed a person had a life beyond a ledger's lines. In quiet moments, Brooklyn still reached for the watch on her dresser. She did not wear it constantly. Sometimes she wanted a wrist free of reasons to look at minutes. But when she lifted it, she felt the tiny press of metal and thought not of past bruises, but of the thing that had made those bruises visible, the ledger, the mic, the careful people who had refused to let a town's memory be overwritten. Change, she knew, was neither simple nor total. There would be other ledgers, other towns, other nights of threat. But there would also be a growing body of people who had learned to count, to name, to insist that the small things be recorded. That, perhaps, was the truest kind of vigilance, not a single triumphant moment, but a disposition toward care that could be taught and persisted. On an ordinary afternoon, when the sky was open and a breeze pushed the last leaves off a neighbor's maple, Brooklyn walked past the playground. A child, sticky from a popsicle, waved her over and asked if she wanted to be on the team for a scootering race. Brooklyn laughed and, without thinking, agreed. She pushed off at a gentle pace, feeling, for the first time in a long while, like someone who could be both careful and light. She kept an eye on the time without letting it own her. She kept a ledger of her life, few pages, plain entries that said who she had visited, which calls she had returned, what she had taught that week. Not all of it mattered to history, but all of it mattered to the continuity of a life. When the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened, she tucked her watch back into the drawer with a small automatic motion. On top of the nightstand lay the field notebook she used when she trained others, a freshly completed page she would add to the archive later. She closed the drawer slowly, the sound intimate. Outside, neighborhood lights blinked awake. Somewhere down the street, a radio played something old and familiar.
Brooklyn stood at the window for a long time, hands in the pockets of her coat, and watched people move. She had seen how small details, a time stamped here, a signature there, could tilt the arc of consequences. She had also learned how fragile those details could be. The work would continue. So would she.